Let's talk now about closing the sale. This is so important, and learning how to do this changed my life completely when I was a young salesman. I used to get so nervous and so tense, and I would start to perspire, and my heart would start to go pound faster when it came to the end of the sales conversation. And then I learned how to close professionally, and my income went up 10 times over the next 2 years. The ability to get your prospect to make a firm buying decision is central to your success in professional selling. All top salespeople are excellent at bringing the sales conversation to a successful close. And learning how to close a sale is a skill that can be developed like riding a bicycle. All sales skills are learnable, and you can learn any skill you need. By the way, the only reason you're nervous about closing the sale is because you're not good at it yet. And as soon as you become excellent at closing the sale, all your nervousness will disappear. In this session, you're going to learn some of the key closing ideas practiced by the top money makers in sales in all fields worldwide. When you learn how to close easily and well at the appropriate time and in the appropriate way, you will take full control over the future of your sales career. So let's talk about closing the sale. The close of the sale is the most stressful part of the sales conversation for both the salesperson and the customer. The fear of failure is 80% of the reason the customer is reluctant or refuses to make a buying decision. The customer is afraid of making a mistake, of paying too much money, of getting the wrong product, of being cheated in some way. So the easiest way to put off that fear is simply to delay a decision or make no decision at all. The fear of rejection accounts for 80% of the reasons why the salesperson does not ask for the order. Salespeople are afraid to hear the word no. They're afraid to have the customer disapprove of them or become irritable or impatient. They're afraid to lose the time they've invested in this customer, so they don't want to ask the question, will you buy the product, because they don't want to hear the word no. They fear rejection more than anything else. Now, fully 50% of all sales conversations end without the salesperson asking for a commitment of any kind. When I was selling at the end of the sales presentation, I would say, well, what do you think? What would you like to do now? And the prospect would say, well, I think I would like to think it over. I'd like to think about it. I say, okay, well, you think about it, and I'll think about it, and we'll both think about it, and we'll talk about it later. Yes, wonderful. Thank you very much. Nice to see you. I learned later that the words, let me think about it, or I want to think about it, mean goodbye forever. We will never meet again. If you allow a person to say, let me think about it, it means that you will never make a sale, and you will probably never see them again. Now, the new model of selling that we talked about earlier gives you a blueprint for reducing the stress involved in closing for both the customer and the salesperson. As we said before, building trust is 40% of the sales conversation. You build trust by taking the time to identify the needs of the customer carefully. You ask a lot of questions. You listen closely to the answers. This lowers the customer's level of stress, and it increases your confidence. Now, in the presentation, you match the customer's needs and your product's benefits closely. The more the customer can see that your product and their needs fit together, the lower is the resistance to buying. Now, if you have already built trust and you've identified needs accurately and you have presented professionally, then confirming and closing the final 10% of the sale is much, much easier. Sometimes the sale closes all by itself. The customer says, well, sounds good to me. I'll take it. How soon can I get it? Now, there are 4 conditions that must be satisfied before you have earned the right to ask for the order. And here they are. The first condition is the customer must need what you are selling. Your product or service should solve the problem or satisfy the need. And both you and the customer are clear that your product or service will do that. The second requirement for closing is the customer must be able to use what you are selling. He or she must be capable of getting maximum value out of the product or service. In other words, you can't sell refrigerators to Eskimos who have no electricity. You can't sell advanced software programs to customers who don't know how to use the programs. You can't sell anything to someone who doesn't have the capability of using it and getting full value. The third requirement for closing is the customer can afford it. He or she has enough money to purchase the product or service without suffering. Sometimes customers want and need and can use your product or service, but they don't have the money, and you must be sympathetic to the fact that this may not be a good idea for this customer at this time. The fourth requirement is the customer must actually want your product or service. He or she must have made this clear. And how do customers make it clear? They say words like, I want it, I need it, I like it, I would like to have it, how soon can I get it? Until you hear words like that, you cannot attempt to close the sale without killing the sale. Now there are two confirming questions that you can ask to be sure that the customer is ready for you to ask the question and close the sale. The first confirming question is, Mr. Prospect, do you have any questions or concerns that I haven't covered? If the prospect says, no, I understand it completely, then you can ask them to buy. The second question you can ask is, Mr. Prospect, does this make sense so far? If the prospect says, yes, it sure makes sense to me, that means that you can now ask them to make a buying decision. There are 5 key closing methods that account for most of the high-level sales made by high-earning sales professionals. The first of these is very simple. It's called the preference close. This is where you give the customer a choice between something and something else, between A and B, and you just simply say, which of these do you prefer? Which of these would you like? This forces the customer to choose one or the other, and the sale is made. It's very simple, and you should try this every time. Now, what if you're selling only one product? Well, then you give a preference between, would you like to take delivery now or next week? Would you like to pay by cash or credit card? Would you like this sent to your office or to your home? So you give a choice of how they acquire the product as opposed to the product itself. But always give people a choice. People love to choose, and when you give them choices, they're much more likely to pick one or the other. The next closing technique, one of the most popular in the world, is called the invitational close. Now, the invitational close is very simple. You simply say, if you like it so far, why don't you give it a try? Why don't you give it a try? Now, the customer can only say, well, because of this or because of that, and give you an opportunity to answer that question or objection. If you're selling a service, you say, why don't you give us a try? If you're selling technical services or insurance services or business services, then you're saying the whole company will take care of you. Why don't you give us a try? If you're selling a hard product, you can say, why don't you take it? Or, why don't you buy it? I had a young guy in my course who told me a great story. He had come to my seminar 2 years before, and he said, Mr. Tracy, he said, when I came to your seminar, you told me that you would give us ideas, would help us to double our income over the next 2 or 3 years. He said, boy, he said, were you wrong. He said that one closing technique, that invitational close, increased my income by 500% in 1 year. He said it transformed my life. I ask it with every single person I talk to. Even if a person says, I don't want it, I can't use it, I'm not interested, it costs too much, I'll always say, well, look, it's a good deal, why don't you give it a try? And it's amazing how many people say, okay, and they give it a try. So then my only question to you would be, the next time you're in a sales situation, why don't you give it a try? The next close, which is really powerful, is called the directive close. The directive close is you ask the question, does this make sense to you so far? The prospect says yes. Then what you do is you assume the customer has said, yes, I'll take it. What happens now? And by assuming the sale, you then ask, well, if you have no further questions, then the next step is this, and you describe the plan of action. Then the next step is, I will need your signature on these 2 forms. I'll need a check from you for this amount. I'll take it back to the office. It will be delivered next Wednesday. In other words, you describe what we call ownership and enjoyment, is what will happen now that you own the product. And the customer starts thinking in terms of ownership. And then here are the magic words. After you have said these things, well then, the next step is this, and you describe the plan of action. You end by saying, and I'll take care of all the details. I'll take care of all the details. And it's amazing how many people will buy using this closing technique. This closing technique is the most popular single technique, the directive close, used by top sales professionals in every field. The 4th closing technique is called the authorization close, and it's really simple. After you've finished the sales conversation, you take out the contract, you put a tick mark next to the signature line, you turn it around and say, well, if you'll just authorize this, we can get started right away. If you will just authorize this, we can get started right away. And then you remain perfectly quiet. You see, in selling, we say the only pressure that you can use is the pressure of the silence after you have asked a closing question. So you say, why don't you give it a try and just remain perfectly silent? If you'll just authorize this, we'll get started right away, and just remain perfectly silent. Now another close you can use, number 4, is called the secondary close. The secondary close is where you focus on a secondary issue, a smaller issue. Sometimes it's called the minor point close. But if the person accepts the smaller issue or term, that means that they've decided to buy the entire product or service. Let me give you another example. You are looking at a car, and an expensive car, and the salesman asks, would you like racing tires on this car, or would you like the factory tires? This is a minor point. You say, well, I'd like the racing tires. You've just decided to buy the car. Someone could be showing you a house, and they would say, would you like to take occupancy on the 1st of the month or the 15th? You say, well, the 15th would be better for me. By answering that question, which is a small question, you've just decided to buy the house. These are very powerful techniques. Now, it's very common for prospects to put you off by saying the words, let me think it over, as I mentioned earlier, even when they're almost ready to buy. So whenever you hear the words, let me think it over, remember this, that if you walk away, you'll probably never see this customer again. And in 50% of cases, when the customer says, I want to think it over, they're ready to buy if you will just take action. So when you hear these words, let me think about it, or let me think it over, you stop, and you smile, and you say, that's a good idea. This is an important decision. This causes the prospect to relax and relieves the tension or stress of buying your product today and making a mistake. Then you ask, obviously you have a good reason for wanting to think it over. Do you mind if I ask what it is? Is it the price? And then remain perfectly silent. Now the prospect can say one of two things. The prospect can say, yes, it's the price, in which case you can say, why do you say that? Why do you feel that way? How far apart are we? How do you mean exactly? You can ask a series of questions, but you're back. You're back and you have an opportunity to sell. Or they could say, no, it's not the price. If they say, no, it's not the price, what do you say? Well, you say, well, then may I ask what it is? And remain perfectly silent. And very often they'll give you just one final term or condition. They'll say, well, it's just this. And if you can answer that, you can get the sale. Now, the final rule is this: always try one more time. If the customer says they don't want it, or they don't need it, or they want to think it over, or they need to talk about it to someone else, say, look, it's a good deal, it's a good price, why don't you just take it? And just remain perfectly silent. Now, the most important word in closing the sale is the word ask. The future belongs to people who ask for what they want. So ask the customer to make a buying decision. Ask the customer if you can proceed to the next stage of the sale and complete the contract. At the very least, ask, what would you like to do now? And very often the customer will say, well, let's go ahead. But don't be afraid to ask. Remember, before you ask, the answer is always no. If after you ask, the answer is still no, you've lost about 10 seconds of your life. But if the answer is yes, you may make a great sale that will change your career. So the most important quality in developing the skill of closing sales is the quality of courage. And you develop courage through practice. So take advantage of what I call the throwaway presentation. This is a presentation when you talk to a prospect who apparently has no interest whatever in your product or service. In this case, what you do is you say, well, I have nothing to lose, so you practice all your selling and closing techniques on him or her. You try this and you try this, and you say this and you say that, and you ask these questions and you close the sale. You ask for the order in every way possible. You have nothing to lose, and you might even be surprised. Sometimes a completely uninterested prospect that you're using every method with can often turn around and become a customer if you persist in asking past the point where you're already convinced that you've lost the sale. Why don't you give it a try? Now, here are some questions that you can ask and answer to apply these ideas on closing to your sales activities. Question number 1. What are the 3 major reasons for stress at the end of the sales conversation, both on the part of the salesperson and the part of the customer? Question number 2. What are 3 things that you can do or say to reduce buyer stress before you ask for the order? 3. What are 3 ways that you can build higher levels of trust in the sales conversation before you attempt to close the sale? Remember, the higher the trust, the lower the resistance to buying your product. Question number 4. What are 3 things that you must be sure of before you ask for the order? Remember, if you ask for the order too soon, you kill the sale. Number 5. What are the 3 best closing techniques discussed in this lesson for you to... say it again. Number 5. What are the 3 best closing techniques discussed in this lesson for your product or service? Which are the ones that would work the best for you? Question 6. What are the 2 confirming questions that you must ask before you can close the sale? And question number 7. What do you say when the customer says, I want to think it over? Write these words down and memorize them so every time the customer says, I want to think it over, you are ready with your response. And finally, what 1 action are you going to take immediately to become a better closer in selling as a result of what you've learned in this session?